Welcome to another episode of Breaking into Cybersecurity, where today we have Catherine Ullman, who will be sharing her amazing experience in digital forensics and getting in all the ones and zeros of that aspect of cybersecurity. Catherine, do you want to give some background about yourself?
Sure. My specialty is DFIR. I started with the University of Buffalo 24 years ago, a little more than that now, and really got involved with IR and then eventually with digital forensics in about 2007 or 8. And my current title is Principal Technology Architect Security. And it's been an interesting journey to get here.
So, what made you interested in digital forensics to begin with? Let's start with that.
Sure. So, the role that I had when I first started at the university was a uh, support, more of a support role. I was doing desktop and server support, and I had a colleague who was starting to learn some incident response, and figuring out things about the early worms and viruses in the industry, which was a very new thing at the time. And he started to teach me about it, and the more interest I had in that space, that really kind of led to understanding what went on under the hood in terms of the system. And that led to an interest in digital forensics, which worked out very well because the university decided they needed a forensics for compliance program, which I wound up building. So that's kind of how I went from just the support space to ultimately, and I really shouldn't say just, right? Because support is incredibly important. And for those who are in the trenches struggling out there, I'm with you. I get it.
So for those that might be interested in transitioning, like you mentioned, from the support space into a field like DFIR, what are some of the recommendations that you might have for them?
So it's a challenging space to move into. One of the things you really need to understand very early on is that there are a variety of different parts of digital forensics. So, for example, there's digital network forensics. So, picking apart network packets and understanding that piece of it. There's also what we often refer to as dead box forensics, and that's where you're going to look at evidence that's on a hard drive. There's now cloud forensics. So, there's first of all, the most important thing I think is to understand that there are all these different areas, and they're all interconnected. So, I've had people ask, where should I start? And my answer is whatever interests you, because they're all interconnected. No matter which one you pick, you will get a good start. So if you're sort of floundering around and you're not really sure, DFIR Diva offers a bunch of resources out there to start to learn about different kinds of forensics. If you're lucky enough to be coming to DEF CON, Packet Hacking Village has some amazing hands-on stuff that we do, where you learn a little bit about Wireshark and looking at network packets. If you're interested in cloud, there is some online, Microsoft offers some free training in that space. So it's really, picking what interests you and going in that direction. Um, in terms of dead box forensics and looking at file systems and operating systems, the first thing that you really have to understand are exactly how file systems work and how they work with the various drive form factors, and that's really challenging. And it was something I didn't really understand when I first jumped into this. So I think those are the things where I would start is, sort of pull on that thread a little bit and see which of those things interest you and then follow the tea leaves from there.
Well, let's kind of talk about that because we
Sure.
initially had this conversation about what is file systems, and
Sure.
today, where most people are using tablets and phones, um, they just see everything in a blob on their device, and they
Right.
might not understand the underlying file system that goes there. How should
Sure.
folks go about learning file systems?
So again, it's tricky. There are some resources, like I said, some of the things that DFIR DIVA offers in terms of learning the beginnings of forensics do touch on file systems. There are some books out there that talk specifically about file systems, um, but sometimes the best way is to get some kind of hex editor and just start poking around and looking at what you can see, right? So something like FTK Imager, which is a free tool that is downloadable, will
Mhm.
allow you to view the file system and the data on your hard drive. And if you use the default settings, it doesn't allow you to make changes, which is ideal when you're first learning. Um, but yeah, that's kind of where I would start. And file systems, for anyone who's not familiar, we're talking about things like the FAT file system or the NTFS file system or EX2, EX2, 3, 4 varieties. And that's, we typically find that in a Linux space. So that's the kind of thing we're talking about.
Great. So for folks now, so they understand the file system, they're starting to look at DFIR Diva. What are
Mhm.
some of the fundamental skills that they should need as you're starting to analyze forensic data?
So critical thinking skills are absolutely top of the chart. We need to really understand um, how to look at things and begin to ask questions. Why am I seeing this? What am I seeing? Could there be a reason for that? So, some of the non-technical skills are the things that are going to be absolutely critical for you. Being patient. All of these skills require immense patience. There are things you can do with file system forensics that are very easy and button clicking. But there are other things that are trickier, and you need to have immense patience because in some cases you're going to spend hours just parsing through looking at things. I certainly have spent time going through images because the case that I was working, they were looking for something specific. So how do you find that? Well, in some cases, you look through every single image on a machine. Sometimes your tools can narrow it down, sometimes they can't. So critical thinking skills, patience for sure, attention to detail, because in many cases, you're going to be looking for very specific details.
Yeah, for example, recently I was using Splunk to do a presentation and I didn't know SPL. So one of the things that I did is just I tried to type out different queries that it would be able to look for within the indexes used there. That
Right.
might be a tool for like cloud forensics and things like that once you have all the logs that come in. But
Yes.
it was a lot of how would a threat actor do something and then go find the things that they would need to do in order to execute on that. Um,
Hmm.
any other recommendations on how someone might show proficiency in these tools if they haven't quite had a lot of on the job experience yet?
So again, I think learning how to take an image of something small, a thumb drive perhaps, and learning how to sort of parse through that as you're going. You'll take classes or you'll read things and you'll start to understand how to look for certain features, right? So perhaps registry entries. And if you can show either with maybe screenshots or some written comments about, I found this, well, what does that mean, how did I find it, being able to articulate what you found and why you found it and why it matters or why it could matter, I think are some great ways that you can illustrate that you understand proficiency with the tools. I think probably the most important thing with regard to the tools to understand is that um, understanding this material really should be tool agnostic. Because if you're serious about doing digital forensics, if you just know how the tool works, I mean, it's important to understand the tool, but if you only understand how a tool works, you do a disservice to yourself and to whatever case you're trying to work. And if you wind up going into, say, law enforcement or working with law enforcement, that can actually bite you. So, so I think the critical thing is to realize it's not proficiency with the tool per se, but proficiency in terms of how to investigate, what to look for, that kind of thing, and why you're seeing the data you're seeing, as opposed to the tool itself. The tool should be a means to an end.
So it sounds like there's a lot of critical thinking skills, the ability to clearly write and communicate what's happening without um, conjecture or
Yes.
adding in what you think might have happened versus this is what the evidence is showing is something that is very clear. How do you take your bias out of that when you're initially beginning and you're like, oh, I think it's going to do this, but it might show up totally different? So, how do you remove yourself as you write this type of content?
So I think that bias is inherent, and I think especially when you're first starting, you're going to have expectations, and I think that's okay. But I think as you move on, hopefully, you'll start to understand why your expectations were accurate and why they perhaps were not accurate. When you become somebody who's actively doing this in the field, again, you can't completely pull yourself out, but you have to resist the urge to say things like, I believe this is what happened, or this evidence appears to be XYZ, and stick to there was this evidence, period, right? Stick with purely factual information. And unless you're considered an expert witness and you're literally on a witness stand as somebody who can take those pieces and put them together, because that's in fact what you're being asked to do, your entire job is, I found this, here is where I found it, here is, what indication this might be. But beyond that, yeah, no conjecture about, well, that indicates that this person did a thing. And that's one of the other big challenges, is that forensics is really good at showing what happened, the ones and zeros, in terms of on a machine or in the cloud or on a network, but it cannot tell you things like why somebody did something, who did it. It can't put hands behind a keyboard directly. So understanding what questions it can answer well and what it can't is, I think, equal as important, so that when you're writing reports or you're communicating this information, you don't accidentally include things like that, because they're not the kinds of things that forensics can answer.
So, as you're beginning out, there's different types of devices. These devices have different states and different states in which you can and can't gather evidence from. How do you ensure that you're gathering the right evidence in the right state, and then also making sure that you're not accidentally deleting the evidence by changing the state of the device?
Yeah, so in order to collect evidence, so I presume by state you mean some things are on, some things are off, some things might be sleeping. So one of the tools that uh, DFIR folks use regularly are things called write blockers. There are software write blockers and hardware write blockers, and I tend to use kind of a combination of both. FTK Imager, by default, the way it's created, is that it's effectively a software right blocking piece of software, but I use that in conjunction with hardware right blockers, and we test those right blockers to make sure that they can't accidentally change something on a drive. So unlike one of the things that I like to point out is traditional forensics, when we're talking about like DNA and fingerprints and whatnot, if you're collecting that sort of evidence, when you go to process that evidence, you destroy some of that evidence as part of the processing process, right? And one big distinction with digital forensics is that we are tasked with keeping that data pristine. So, we use things like rate blockers to try to, enforce that. In terms of state, where that becomes a really serious thing is if you have a system that's encrypted, for example. So let's say a Windows system running BitLocker. If you come upon a system running BitLocker and you don't have the key, you want to make absolutely certain you take what's called a logical image. And a logical image of the machine will show you everything that you'd have access to sitting down essentially at the keyboard. But it will not give you anything under the hood because it only gives you access to what the file system at that point can access. You can take an image of that machine off, but what will happen is you go to boot the machine once you've taken the image, and you'll have access to nothing unless you have the key. So it is the case sometimes that we do both, right? So even if we know we have the key, we might take a logical image just in case the key doesn't work, if the machine is on. So that's another thing to keep in mind. And in addition, one area I didn't mention, there's also memory forensics. And so memory forensics is something that you would grab when a machine is on, typically not once it's been turned off. So that is something that is incredibly important, especially in terms of like a malware situation where you're trying to capture something that's hidden, that's running in memory. And the minute you shut the machine off or disconnect from the network, now you've lost all of that information.
Yeah, I think things like this, in the beginning, folks often misunderstand, or because they're not aware of it, they might accidentally do something like change the state, or, um, for example, if they grab a phone to try to image it and they don't shield it from other signals, it could receive a self erase signal from the owner attempting to destroy the evidence. So, understanding
Absolutely.
things like how the device can be altered remotely, how it needs to be segregated from the environment, all very important things. Um, would you say that there's specific classes or things that folks should do to really try to up their game if they're interested in this field and they want to advance their skills?
Sure. There are a number of options. The company, I think it's called Hexordia, has some inexpensive options. And they've got some amazing training they have there. Again, DFIR Diva offers a list of online things that are either inexpensive or free. If you want to get kind of to that next level, and you're working in a space that is either law enforcement, government, or you're working for a company that does do forensics, because there are some caveats here. There is an organization called IASIS, which is where I got some of my foundational training, and they're nowhere near as expensive as something like SANS, which of course SANS also offers forensics training, and it's very good training, but it's extraordinarily expensive. So,
Mhm.
if you're working for an entity that can send you to SANS training, or you have the opportunity to do some of their they do a work study program that is cheaper, and if you have that opportunity, that's fabulous. But for folks who don't have those opportunities, those are some other things that places that you can look for some foundational training. And I can't say enough good things about IASIS. It is run by all volunteer folks who are either current or ex law enforcement, typically, who have been doing this for a long time. And as a result, the focus to a certain degree does tend to be on criminal investigations, but they spend a lot more time on the foundations like file systems and drive systems, and making sure that you really understand that before you move forward and start looking for other things, registry items or files or whatnot. So those are the places that I think are great to start with.
Perfect. And with regards to any text or textbooks that you might recommend, any books that you might recommend for folks looking to learn more as well, any authors that you feel like have really influenced your career?
So Brian Carrier has a book called File System Forensic Analysis, which is absolutely spectacular. That is probably considered the gold standard as far as file systems go. It's not a brand new book, but it's very solid and used regularly. So that is absolutely one place that I would recommend. Um, Generally speaking, the other books tend to be they're often focused. Harlan Carvey has some good forensics books out there. There's there are books like Investigating Windows Systems. If you're specific to Windows, um, but it's going to depend really on what you're trying to do. Um, and what I find is that there aren't necessarily solid books that cover all the things, right? So you're
Mhm.
going to read any one of these general forensics books will take you sort of down a path, but then either talk about Windows or Mac or Linux, and then you're going to need to do a deeper dive once you kind of get to which of those things. Same if you go cloud, right? Because each cloud platform is a little different in terms of how they work.
Mhm.
Same with networking. So um, I think it really kind of depends at that point.
Okay. And for those that are trying to figure out which might be easier to get started with, do you think like device forensics, OS forensics, cloud forensics,
I
anyone has a easier point of entry?
I think that like what I would call dead box forensics. So imaging a local machine is probably the easiest in the sense
Mhm.
that you don't have to have anything special. The tools that are available for free will allow you to begin and poke at things. And one more text that I forgot to mention. Brett Shavers just came out with a new book that should be very helpful to a lot of folks who are doing investigations. Let me just find the title of that. And he also does some other training. It is called the DFIR Investigative Mindset, which kind of takes it back a step. So not necessarily thinking very specifically about the ones and zeros, but making sure that you understand the conceptual ideas before you start poking at whether it's a machine or a cloud space or what have you. But yeah, I think probably doing an investigation on a local machine is, a thumb drive, starting with something small, is probably the easiest way. There are tools that will let you do things like memory forensics, but I think unless you have some solid background understanding processes and things like Windows and Linux, that could be a little more challenging.
Okay, okay. That's great. I'm gonna share all of these links. Anything you feel like I haven't asked you that over the years you found that has been extremely helpful for those looking to come in, those looking to grow, that you'd want to share?
I think the only other thing I would add is that, kind of going along with my comments about patience, is that because this field is so broad, you not only have to have patience with the technologies, but you need to have patience with yourself. As with everything in security, people ask me where to start, and I, you know, is there a good place to start? And my answer is no. Jump in the deep end, because straight up there is no shallow end. And what does that mean? Well, it means you're going to flail a little, and that is okay. If you have the opportunity to go to conferences where they're talking about forensics and you don't understand any of it, guess what? That's okay too. Go and sit and don't understand a word and write a few things down that sort of sound interesting. And what you'll find later on is all of a sudden some of these things will start to click if you just start pulling on threads. I actually took one of the SANS courses first, and I was because back when I took this class, they didn't have the path they have now. So the initial SANS courses were like 4, not 504, but like 4. And they had like a class in each of these areas. They didn't have a path. So the first
Mhm.
course I took, I was very, very lost in. And then when I went back and did the IASIS training and got that solid foundation and then came back to the material I'd learned in SANS, all of a sudden I was like, oh, well, of course, this makes complete sense. So, not only having patience for the tech, but absolutely having patience for yourself and realizing you're just not going to get it right away. And that is perfectly okay.
And for someone that doesn't or may not do this type of work every day, how would you recommend that they continuously improve and continuously develop themselves?
So I'll be honest, I don't do forensic cases every single day. It's kind of hit and miss now. But I find that things like CTFs are great. There are a ton of CTFs out there that have forensics challenges in them, and that is a great place to kind of keep your chops up. So anytime you see, somebody offering a free CTF that you can do either at a conference that you're attending or maybe remotely, um, that's a great place to play.
Absolutely love it. Thank you so much for coming on and for sharing your knowledge. Really appreciate it. And folks, feel free to follow up with Catherine. Her LinkedIn link is here. I'll also share her biography and the rest of her contact information or socials in the show notes. So feel free to reach out. And thank you all. If you find this interesting, do share it with others. Do subscribe, and we'll talk to you next time with another person sharing helpful tips for breaking into cybersecurity. Thank you
Thanks, Chris.
all.